Every show starts with a first episode. So, welcome to episode one of Destiny for Nomads podcast. Opening the show and joining me from Melbourne, Australia is David Fuller. David has been a digital nomad since 1999. So, basically 24 years. Maybe he was the first digital nomad ever. David works as a consultant for Pilote Media, which is a company based in the UK. He says that being a digital nomad allows him to view the world through a different lens and understand local nuances. The problem, though, is that the world is set up based on a single address system for bank accounts, insurance, ID, etc. And I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about that. David's recommendation for other digital nomads or aspiring digital nomad: understand your runway. How long can you survive with no income? So have an exit strategy. Where will you go if you need to get out? How will you get out? Etc. David, thank you very much for joining me on episode one.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So were you the first digital nomad ever?
I think they just called them backpackers back then.
Yeah. Okay.
I know when I started, the concept of being a digital nomad was a little bit different. You had to access the internet via internet cafes, and if you weren't in an internet cafe paying $3 an hour or something even more extortionate than that, then you had to deal with dial-up. So that's how long ago it was.
Yeah, I remember I left. So I'm not a digital nomad, but I left France in 1999 too, like in October 1999, to go to Laos. I remember exactly what you're talking
I
about.
must have missed you by a couple of months. I was in Laos in '99 as well, and
Well, I arrived there. I landed on the 3rd of October 1999. I still remember that day.
I sent a. I remember Laos actually had very, very little internet when I was there in '99, and I remember
Yeah.
sending one of those aerograms, the envelopes that you used to fold out, and I literally wrote a handwritten letter to my mum and sent it from Laos. And when I returned 3 months later, it still hadn't arrived. So being a digital nomad in Laos in '99 was not an option.
But what's a digital nomad then?
I think the term has become popularized by people whose work allows them to deliver their work from basically anywhere there's an internet connection. So that was I think that was the big change. You used to be able to do some work remotely and maybe send it via email or whatever, but the speeds of internet, access to internet, and the ability for somebody to work 100% remote with only a laptop and the connection to the internet, whether that's tethering off a mobile phone or in an internet cafe or carrying a laptop around. I think that's the big change. And some of those people are coders, some of those people are copywriters, some of those people are there's a wide range of those people, but effectively it allows them to deliver their work product via an internet connection only.
Right. So the most important aspect of being a digital nomad is it's the digital aspect.
It's the connectivity part.
Yeah.
You can't be submitting work via mail. It's got to be, you might be on a VPN coding directly into a system or whatever. But yeah, connectivity I think is the big thing that's changed the nomadic experience, because there's been nomads for thousands of years, but the digital nomad is specifically about people who create their work product digitally and use connectivity, global connectivity, to be able to deliver that from anywhere in the world, basically.
Right. Why did you start your journey?
So I grew up in Australia. Well, I grew up in Melbourne, where I am now. And as an Australian living on the other side of the world, you get a feeling or a sense that you are disconnected from the globe. Again, this is
Mm.
pre-internet. 1999, I was using very basic internet at work, but I had to book time on a computer in order to get access to it. I think I got my very first Hotmail email address just before I left Australia. But yeah, I started as a backpacker. I wanted to see the world. I wanted to go and get experience of places that I'd read about that I'd never visited. And on my way to Europe, I had access to a work visa in the UK, which I was lucky enough to have because of Australia being part of the British Commonwealth. So on my way to the UK to work using that visa, I stopped off in Thailand and Laos and Vietnam and various other Southeast Asian countries on my journey. So that's what prompted it. And then I think the second time, I was going the other way. I was leaving the UK and I was headed back to Australia. And yeah, the digital part was a lot easier then on the way back than it was on the way there.
Yeah, but I'm very happy to start this episode with you because you got so much experience traveling.
Yeah.
And you've been like, you transited from being a backpacker to a digital nomad, a real one. So this podcast is made for people who want to optimize their digital nomad's life. What would you tell them? Where would you start?
So I think the hardest part is making the decision. You know, the hardest part is actually just taking that step off the cliff. And it's a bit like that Indiana Jones movie where he sort of steps off the cliff and his foot finds the hidden path. It's really taking that initial step to make it happen is really the hardest part for a lot of people, and especially if you've worked for in a corporate environment, or you're used to having a safety net, or you're used to having all the comforts of working in a corporate, whether that be somebody to fix the printer or somebody to make sure that the coffee is full every morning. You know, if you've never done freelance work or you've never worked in an agency or a startup, then I think that walking away from a corporate role into a digital nomad role is probably harder. But having said that, like I said, the hardest part is taking the first step, making the decision. And then I think you need to perhaps have a little bit of humility, but start in places that are easier. So, for example, somewhere where you can speak the language. I would start, somewhere that you can speak the language. If you try and start somewhere where you can't speak the language, the level of difficulty is going to be a lot higher. And there are sites around that can show you a whole bunch of statistics around safety of certain places, what the internet speeds are like, what the cost of living is like, so all of that information is available. And if you do your research, choose a place that is digital nomad friendly as your first point of call, rather than trying to bite off something that sounds exotic and exciting and making it difficult for yourself.
Right. So have a plan.
Yeah.
Take the leap of faith. Have a plan. Don't make it too hard for you on the first time. I know what you're saying because I went from France to Laos. That was like a big cultural shock, but I loved it from day one. But I understand that it might be very difficult for some people. I've seen that with people traveling to Laos, coming from, especially if you come from a developed country and you're moving into like an emerging country. It's not like coconut and sand beaches and palm trees all the time. That's that's
not
Instagram
Van
stories.
Gien, it's not, no.
But being digital nomad, is it for everyone though?
Definitely not. No. Like I said, I think you kind of need need to be wired in a certain way. You need to be able to deal with challenges. Just little things that might go wrong, like not being able to connect to the internet. a lot of us live in first world cities, and we take broadband connectivity for granted.
Yeah.
We take the ability to be able to get relatively cheap mobile internet and be able to tether a device, and we sort of again take that for granted. We take it for granted that things will just work, and depending on where you choose to be a digital nomad, you need to have the type of personality that if something goes wrong, and it does regularly, you need to be able to deal with that. And like I say, you need to be able to deal with being able to fend for yourself without necessarily having support around you, or being able to call someone from a certain department and have them come and fix an issue for you in place. But having said that, I also think that the pandemic has probably made it an easier transition for some people, because they might have spent the last 2 or 3 years working from home remotely, and therefore a transition to a more digital nomad life is easier than going straight from a cubicle or an open plan office into a digital nomad environment.
Yeah. And not to mention also that you need to have the right type of passport, I guess. Yeah, because you can't, depending on which country you're from, it's going to be easier for you to enter some countries than others.
Yeah, so I think that is definitely true, and you need to look at that. You need to look at the digital nomad as with most things digital. There is a lens which we tend to look through, which is a Silicon Valley lens or a London lens, or and not everybody does have the same freedoms. I'm lucky enough to have an Australian passport and a UK passport. There are not many countries that I can't get a visa on entry for, and those that I can't get a visa on entry will grant me a visa if I pay the right fees for the visa. But I know that certain passports, there are restrictions on entry to certain parts of the world. Either it's impossible to travel, or getting a visa is not necessarily straightforward. So you need to check that if you're. You need to do that for travel, but it's even more important that you check not just the entry requirements, but also the working requirements, because it's one thing to enter a country saying that you're a tourist, and it's quite another thing being there and working there. And it's a bit of a gray area. If you're sitting in a cafe working on your laptop, you probably won't be bothered. If you're turning up to the same office every day, the same co-working space every single day, and sitting at the same desk every day, then it may be perceived by the local authorities that you are working in the country. And if you don't have the right visa, then that could be a problem.
Yeah, they can kick you out or ask you for some money. Yeah. Yeah. Would you say that being a digital nomad is a privilege?
Yes, I do. I
Why
think
is that?
well, again, you need to have a certain level of means. And I think, in your introduction, you said, what's something that you need to think about. And there's new models coming along. So, for example, most of my digital nomad experience has been kind of at the harder end, where I'm working almost freelance, working for myself. And that is a high risk strategy, because, like I say, you need means, you need money in the bank, you need to be able to, if you've got no money coming in, you need to be able to survive, whether that's paying for an Airbnb or accommodation, or a flight home if you need to get out, and being able to build that runway or that amount of cash, and it's got to be liquid, right? You can't have that sitting in an illiquid asset like a house. If you get into trouble, you've got to be able to have that money to hand, and be able to spend it quickly if you need it. And to be able to have those means is not necessarily available to everybody. It's changed a little bit in the last few years. Again, there are ways in which companies are more open to have salaried workers working remotely and travel, and there's accommodation options and there's various other things so that your risk and exposure is limited. But yeah, you need to be able to afford to travel. You need to be able to afford to book airfares. You need to be temporary accommodation is more expensive than long-term accommodation. So you need to be able to afford that. If you want to work in a country, a place like Melbourne, you need to be able to afford smashed avocado on toast at $25, and that's not a cheap option. Yeah. Same with Dubai. Dubai is seen as a sort of dream digital nomad destination, but it's not cheap.
Indeed.
So yeah, that's why I think it's partly a privilege. I think it's also you need to be able to work in a role that gives you the opportunity. So if you're a coder, great. If you're a freelance copywriter, great. If you're working in a manufacturing role, then you've got to be on site. You don't have necessarily the ability to be a digital nomad if you're not doing a digital job. I think it also is a factor of age, and you need to make some big lifestyle choices. If you've got kids that are school age, unless you've got the means to put them into boarding school while you travel around the world, it's not an option for people who are married with kids.
Yeah, I interviewed a family on a bike tour. They've been traveling on a bicycle more than now it must be like 80,000 kilometers.
Okay.
And they had 2 kids while traveling, and 2 daughters, and the daughters have been traveling with them. But they have to, they homeschool them, and it's a completely, they are real digital nomad. But like you said, it's a completely different lifestyle. I'm interested in going back to your experience and what you said about one of the problems of being a digital nomad is what I mentioned it in my introduction. You said that the world is set up based on a single address system. You were talking about bank accounts, insurance, ID, etc. Can you explain a little bit more about what the problem is?
So I haven't been to a country yet where your identity is not linked to your physical presence or address. And when you live a normal life, a non-digital nomad life, that's not a problem. But when you think about it, everything that you do, and it's become slightly easier recently, but certainly when I left, getting a mobile phone in any country, in many countries, still requires proof of address. Just to get a SIM card, you need to prove where you live. And in some cases, for some things, whether it's getting a bank account or certainly getting access to finance, your credit scoring is based on your physical address, your proof of ID, you need to provide 3 forms of ID, and those IDs need to have your address on them. And in some cases, that address needs to be for 3 years. You need to prove your address for 3 years, going back 3 years. That's just how the world has been designed. And so being a digital nomad where you cannot prove where you have been living, or say this is my address, is very difficult, and it makes life difficult for a lot of things. And that's without even thinking about the residency rules, which are pretty bizarre. How many days you're allowed to spend in a certain country without violating the visas or whatever else. But and that, if you're American, then that's a factor of degree even more difficult, because you've got to pay tax irrespective of where you are. So yeah, it's just the way the systems have been designed. Who you are and your identity is linked to your physical location and your address. And for many people, the concept that you don't have a permanent address is so foreign and so bizarre that they just haven't built the systems to account for those edge cases.
Yeah. Although there are countries now creating like special, well, more and more countries creating special visas for digital nomads. I'm thinking, especially in Europe, Portugal, I think, well, Estonia, of course, and I've heard about other countries.
Yeah.
But
I think the UAE, Dubai has now got a sort
yeah.
of digital nomad visa. But even so, many of them assume that you have a home address. So if you don't have a home address, then even if you're traveling, they kind of assume that you're traveling, but you're traveling temporarily, and that also kind of assumes that you have a home address, which again can become quite difficult. I mean, it can even become difficult when Google decides that it's going to change the language based on your IP address without you necessarily giving it consent.
Yeah, that's boring. Oh, now you live in Finland. Okay, here you are. Everything in Finnish. Yeah. But
yeah.
it goes back to
it's
what you
not
were
set up. The world is set up for people who have an address.
Yeah, but it goes back to what you were saying earlier on in the conversation about do your research. Plan before you leave. Like, you're going to need a bank account. So where is going to be your bank account? You're going to need cash. Some countries are still very cash based. And so you need cash because you have to have that exit strategy just in case something happens to you and you need to be evacuated. You're going to need an insurance. Where do you get an insurance? And by the way, this podcast is sponsored by Medical for Nomads. And I recommend you guys check out the medical insurances they offer. But what about your ID?
So that's brand
visas,
new,
etc. Yes.
So the medical insurance for people who aren't in a certain country is brand new, and it's up until now to get global health insurance without an address has been either incredibly expensive or impossible.
Yep. It is true. And yeah, like you said, it's brand new. Medical for Nomads was created like 3 years ago, and they really they have a product targeting digital nomads and remote workers where pretty much wherever they are in the world, except in USA, because the US is always very complicated.
Anything to do with insurance in the US is fun.
Another question for you. What are some of the common misconceptions you have seen about digital nomadism?
That's an interesting question because I think it's still a fairly edge case type of lifestyle. Like, and going back to that sort of privilege question that you asked before, I think there's probably far fewer digital nomads than people think there are. But although it might be growing, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens post-pandemic. It was starting to become very, very trendy before COVID. Then COVID kind of killed it, and everyone had to either return to their homes or get stuck in the place that they were. So for me, I was in Dubai when COVID hit, and basically I couldn't get out of Dubai. And if I had have got out, I would have had to make a choice whether I go to the UK or to Australia. And again, I'm lucky, very, very lucky that I have 2 passports and that I could have gone to either the UK or Australia. I chose not to do either, and I'm glad I did. Because if I'd gone to Australia, I would have been locked into Australia for 3 years and wouldn't have been able to get out of Australia. And there's been some horror stories of people who've been separated from their families, who literally haven't been able to get on a plane and return to their families. So what was the question?
The common misconceptions about
common misconceptions. Yeah. So I think the biggest misconception is that it's fun and easy.
Yeah.
It's like entrepreneurialism. People have the same kind of misconceptions about being an entrepreneur as they do about being a digital nomad. They kind of assume that, it's all having a great time and drinking coffee and, whatever, but actually it's 24/7 hard work. And being a digital nomad can be fun. I mean, certainly I enjoy meeting new people, and I enjoy experiencing new cultures, and, as I said at the beginning, experiencing the world through a lens which is not the first world sitting in a big city lens. So I enjoy that, but the biggest misconception is that it's fun and games all the time, and it's not. It can be incredibly lonely. You don't necessarily have a network of friends and family. You can try and meet other nomads. There's various networking events and things like that, but a lot of those friendships are very temporary, and so it can be quite a lonely existence. It can be at sometimes incredibly challenging, especially when you're talking about bureaucracy and just things that you would hope would work and expect to work that don't work.
Yeah.
So
and the thing is that you can't explain that to people who've been living in developing countries, because you have to experience it to understand what you're saying. I know exactly what you're saying, but I can't explain it.
But even places like Greece, I've been in Athens for the last couple of years, and Athens is part of the European Union. It's a very, in some senses, it's a very modern country, but in many other senses, it's an incredibly backwards country. And especially if you don't speak Greek, it's almost impossible to get things done. So yeah, it sounds nice, but I wasn't in Santorini or Mykonos. I was in Athens, and again, that's a very different experience. So going to Santorini or Mykonos for a week's holiday is one thing. Living and working in a place like that long term is a very different proposition. So it's not a holiday. It's not a working holiday. It's work, just in a different place. And yeah, it's not always fun. And I think also it's not necessarily a misconception, but it's just little things that people don't necessarily think about until they experience it. Like you say, like working in remote time zones. You think you can get things done, but actually you realize there's only 1 hour of overlap between business hours between Melbourne and Denmark. And therefore, if I want to have a conversation with someone in Denmark while I'm sitting in Melbourne, this time now is the only hour that there's a shared business hours. And that means I have to completely change the way I live my life. It means I can't go out at night because I need to be doing business with Europe, or I need to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning because I want to have a call with Atlanta, or the East Coast of America. And that is not an easy thing to get your head around. You can't necessarily work the hours that 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever hours you might be used to working. You might have to do some very, very long days and wake up very early or stay up very late in order to get things done.
Yeah. Well, it's a good reality check. Again, ties back to what you were saying earlier on, but you need to plan for it. It's not for everybody. Okay, it's great, but be realistic, and maybe, like you were saying earlier on, again, start slow. Don't make a big jump into a country that is too far from your current environment in terms of lifestyle.
I mean, you can push yourself out of your comfort zone, but there's also some sort of soft landing places as well. And I think there's certain places, like I know that I've never been, but I know Bali is very popular with the digital nomad crowd, and I can sort of understand why Bali would be popular with a digital nomad crowd. And places that I've got a lot of digital nomads are probably easier than places that don't have a lot of digital nomads. I think I could count about 6 in Athens at any given time, and they weren't really digital nomads. They were just people who said they were.
I will be interviewing someone who's been in Bali, she will be able to tell us more about the community over there. All right, David. So you're in Australia now, back home. Are you planning to move to travel again?
Yeah, so I think my concept of being a digital nomad is going to change. It will be, I'll still be traveling the same distances, but I'll be in the same country.
Okay.
So, for example, from Melbourne to Sydney is 800 kilometers. From Melbourne to Brisbane, I think, is double that. So, yeah, 1,600 kilometers. To Perth is a 5-hour flight from where I'm at. So, some people don't know just how big Australia is. It's a very big place. So, yeah. A 5-hour flight across Europe, you're getting from London to Athens. A 5-hour flight in Australia, you're still in Australia.
True.
So I plan on traveling, but perhaps within the borders of Australia. New Zealand's only 2 hours away. But my lens is going to change because I'm looking at Oceania and Australasia and perhaps Southeast Asia rather than the Middle East and Europe, which is where my focus has been for the last couple of years. But,
well, that's a good concept to start. Maybe start try out digital nomadism in your own country first.
Yeah, and to be honest, there's some really good now accommodation options as well. And I know that there's some ones that are being targeted more at corporates to allow people who are salaried and working for corporates to be able to move around and access accommodation, flats and various things. So there's a few of those concepts which are springing up. And so if you're in the US, for example, there's 50 something states in the US. Just try doing it in a different state first. And if you can make it work in a different state, maybe you'll be able to make it work in a different country.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Any last words before we conclude?
It'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. I think the next I'll step back and say it. I think the next phase of digital nomads is actually not where it has been. I think the next phase of digital nomads will be people who are older rather than people who are younger.
Interesting.
I think there will be people who are either forced to go into mandatory retirement but don't want to retire, that will be able to work digitally and will basically sort of say, right, I'm going to just travel the world as if I was retired, but I'm going to keep working via my laptop or do projects or whatever. I think that, again, because of the things we've mentioned in terms of means and time and freedom and all the things that you kind of need to be a digital nomad, you either do that when you're very young, or I think what's going to emerge is more people who are in their 50s or in their 60s who will become digital nomads because their kids have left the home, they've got freedom, they want to continue to work, and they can do that. So perhaps that's the next preconception that people might have of digital nomads as being, young coders. My prediction might be that actually the next wave of digital nomads will be more elderly, older workers.
All right. Well, we will see. Thank you, David, for your time today. Last question. If people are interested in talking to you about digital nomadism or anything else, how can they contact you?
I'm on every social media and have been for years. Well, no, that's not true. I was late to Facebook. I was early to Twitter, late to Facebook. I think I was one of the first 6,000 people on LinkedIn.
Right.
So I think that's that's just before I do that. You need to network. If you're going to be a digital nomad, you can't be a solitary individual. You need to network. You need to get out and meet people. So use LinkedIn, use Nomad List, use some of the other sites that are out there, and network like crazy, because otherwise it makes it very difficult. But yeah, if you want to find me, I created a Hotmail address in '99 when I left, and it was the first three initials of my my name. But so it's DM Freedom. I have been DM Freedom on everything that's ever been invented, every platform. I'm DM Freedom on every platform.
And Hotmail still exists? God.
I don't know if my Hotmail address still exists. I've got I still got my Yahoo mail.
Okay. So DM Freedom at Yahoo.
Just DM Freedom. You can get me on Instagram. You can get me on Twitter. You can get me wherever you want on DM Freedom.
Great.
Or dmfreedom.com.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time, David, today.
Thanks, Laurent. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
And that's the wrap for today's Destiny for Nomads episode. I hope you found the insights and tips shared by David helpful in your own journey towards location independence. Don't forget to tune in next time for more inspiring stories and expert advice. Until then, subscribe to the podcast no matter where you are